What better time is there to talk the Vanir than summer? Welcome to the Vanek episode. The Vanir are probably some of the most well-known of the Nordic gods after the Aesir. They are the second of what you could call three broad divine clans that exist within this body of myth and spirituality. They, in contrast to the Aesir, have, you could say, a much more mystical and, you could say, earthy feel to them. Though I personally wouldn't go so far as to call them gods of nature. That role, I think, is more completely fulfilled and represented by the Jotnar. That said, they do have a certain liminal quality, along with strong associations with the natural world, that set them apart from the Aesir as well as the Jotnar. In this explainer, I'm going to get more into who the Vanir as a group of gods are, what they represent, and how this in-between role, this liminality, this role of being of humanity, but also of the natural world around us, that really makes the Vanir who and what it is they are. Like the Aesir explainer, I'm going to start off by getting into who the Vanir are. I'm going to then dive more into what they are generally associated with. And then I'm going to finish up with the one thing the Vanir are also especially strongly associated with: magic and mysticism. So, let's kick this off. As I said earlier, I think the best way of describing the Vanir is as gods of the liminal, as not necessarily gods of nature, as they are often classically depicted, which is understandable given the associations that many of them, like say Freyr and Njord, for example, have with aspects of the natural world, but as gods who are closely associated with humans relating and interacting with the natural world. As I'll get into a bit more over the course of this explainer, you could see them much more as go-betweens, as these gods that straddle both worlds and are most truly at home within that in-between space. Nothing, I think, better affirms this than the close relationship that the Vanir have with Seidr, magic, and the Alfar. Where the Vanir come from, mythically and historically, is a bit of a mystery, really. They first show up in the prose and poetic Edda after the creation of the world that came about through the destruction of Ymir by Odin, Vili, and Ve. It's sort of unclear as to when exactly they come into the story, as the first real mention of them in surviving source materials is when they come into conflict with the Aesir, initiating the first war in this current iteration of creation. One could suppose they were there at the ordering of Midgard and created their own realm, Vanaheim, around the same time that the Aesir crafted Asgard. But this is stuff that really isn't in surviving source material. Historically speaking, it's also pretty hotly debated as to where the Vanir come from. One particularly popular theory that you'll probably see in a lot of different sources that deal with Nordic myth, whether they are written by pagans or by scholars, is that the Vanir may have been gods of a pre-agricultural people who already were living within Scandinavia at the time that pastoralists, or possibly even more agriculturally inclined groups who were associated with the Aesir, migrated into those regions. It's also argued that the Vanir may have come with the development of agriculture, and that the Aesir were the original gods of the pastoral groups living within Scandinavia prior to the adoption of this new technological package. These discussions also parallel speculation that the Jotnar may have originally been gods that were, or at least Nordic interpretations of, the powers associated with Sami groups that neighbored Nordic communities. Unfortunately for us, this is a question that, barring the appearance of a strange shape-shifting individual with a magic blue box, will never be truly answered. If there were anything that was written down describing the Vanir and their origins, or the peoples who first venerated them, also in contrast to those who first venerated the Aesir, it has been lost to time. This is also where I, yet again, must bring class into the equation. The functions and the roles that the Vanir take on within Nordic myth, along with their associations, are ones that are a bit further out, socially speaking, from those that the Aesir are most strongly associated with. The fact that the Aesir are also closely associated with gods that are linked to things like writing and literacy further suggests that those who were adherents of the Vanir were probably groups that were a bit less likely to have these particular skills. The Aesir also get a bit of selection bias at work when we're talking about surviving source materials, because the stuff they were associated with, as well as the peoples who, as far as we know, historically patronized them, were also the wealthy warrior elites who increasingly promoted the worship of the Aesir and also had the resources to do things like preserve records of them in written form. Despite this, we still do have a decent amount of material that refers to the Vanir, most particularly Freyr, Freya, and Njord, the three Vanic gods who were traded as hostages with the Aesir to end the conflict between these two groups. We also have some description of Gullveig, whose name means gold hungry or lust for gold, because she is usually described as being one of the catalysts for the initial conflict between the Aesir and the Vanir. Snorri Sturluson also mentions several other deities who may have been potentially or are explicitly mentioned as Vanic in his Prose Edda. Though, like he does when he's describing the goddesses and many other figures, this is sort of more in passing and with sort of a brief coda as to what it is they were associated with than necessarily going into deeper description of the stories and myths surrounding them. I personally suspect this bias towards these particular Vanir in surviving source materials is, again, because they are the ones who interacted most with the Aesir, and thus would have been seen as most significant by those who are already predominantly Asic in their religious practices and in their inclinations as far as what myths they were most attracted to. So, with all of that said, what is it that makes the Vanir the gods that they are? And particularly, what is it that gives grounds for saying they are very much gods of the liminal? The answer to that can be found in what it is they're broadly associated with, starting with the three who are best known in surviving source material. Freyr is the god who is often described as being the bringer of peace and plenty, the bringer of fertility and prosperity, and sort of has some broad similarities in myth, and this is parallels that have been drawn by modern pagans to figures like the Green Man, Cernunnos, and other similar gods in other places, all the way down to Freyr wielding a staghorn spear when he charges forth to fight at Ragnarok. Though the animal he does seem to be more strongly associated with is the boar, as shown by his great boar Gullinbursti, which he is said to ride into battle. What contrasts Freyr with, say, Sif of the Aesir is that where Sif is clearly associated with the harvest and agricultural labor, something that's very firmly within the sphere of humanity, Freyr is more generally associated with a broader sense of fecundity and fertility, something best shown by how in surviving cult objects that are believed by archaeologists to have been used in the worship of Freyr, where statues and figurines depicting this god include a large erect phallus. He is certainly also strongly associated with masculinity, although the kind of masculinity that Freyr comes with is a much more romantic and nurturing sort than the more violent aspects that you can see with Odin, or the more protective ones that come with Thor. Freyr is also named as King of the Alfar, a role which I'm going to get into a little bit later, but is sort of important for understanding this sense of liminality and in-betweenness. His sister Freya, who in some sources is described as a twin, though this is argued to be more of a modern interpretation and sort of insertion of, well, there has to be an Apollo and Artemis pairing within this body of myth because everything in comparative mythology has to be Greek somehow. Freya is a bit less the fertility of the green world and all that, and more passion, magic, and also to an extent war, as shown by her relationship with the Valkyries. Freya is the one who is named as the Queen of the Valkyries, and, it must be said, gets first pick of the battlefield dead before Odin then takes the rest into Valhalla. Now, it may seem odd to have a goddess who's a bit more associated with, say, emotion, magic, and war than necessarily something that's outright of the natural world, if one assumes that the Vanir are, strictly speaking, deities of the natural world. This is where I think it is better to understand them much more as the deities of the liminal. What Freya works in are things that are within that in-betweenness as well, particularly because of how Seidh works as a mystical art that is founded on moving across boundaries, creating bridges between worlds, and manipulating the possibilities of weird. What further reinforces this is Freya's falcon feather cloak, which is said to give her the power of flight. Another example of her power, which devotees of Freya will also often point to, is that her chariot is pulled by a team of cats, which both makes her the goddess of cats, in a sense, and also one of the only beings in any body of myth who's capable of making cats follow her commands and work together. Freya is also described as the most beautiful of all the gods, though what constitutes this beauty entirely depends on who it is that's looking upon or interacting with Freya. She is also strongly associated with all things feminine and is often described as fiercely independent and standing on her own, though also possessing great grief at the loss of her husband Odd, who at some point disappeared from myth, and in her searching for Odd across all the 9 worlds, she is said to have wept tears which when they fell upon the land became amber, and when they struck the water became gold. Rounding out this trio is the father of both of these deities, Njord. Often shorthanded as a god of the sea, Njord is more properly understood as the god of sailing and maritime craft, a particular art and trade that is one that depends as much on having very specific skills of things like navigation, boat building, and all kinds of other related forms of expertise, as well as having clear understanding of the world that they're going into and interacting with. A world that, without question, is pretty hostile to human beings. We are, after all, species that evolved on land and lack things like gills, and salt water is more effective as a rather vicious purgative than as a source of hydration for members of our species. This liminalness and intimate knowledge that comes with these particular crafts and skills when we're talking about Njord especially becomes important when one looks at how maritime travel worked within the Nordic world. Sailing upon the oceans was not just a question of navigating by the stars or using certain innovations like Icelandic spar, which is also described in some places as a sunstone and helps for finding the sun when the sky is too cloudy to be able to see it, but also by a somewhat lost art that is known as wayfinding. Wayfinding is a kind of navigation that has been developed by maritime cultures independently all over the world, and it is a form of navigation that depends very much on having a deep knowledge of the currents, tides, and sea conditions of the particular waters where the sailors in question are making their voyages. Wayfinders are known to have even used details like the taste of particular water, the texture of specific mud gathered by the use of things like sounding weights, which is something that is recorded all the way up into the late 19th century in many different places, and otherwise using a kind of knowledge that depended less on specific instrumentation, science, and mathematics, and more on having a close relationship with the world around you. One of the best examples of this presence of wayfinding that we have within the Nordic world comes from a medieval source known as the Konungsskuggsja, which translates as the King's Mirror, which is a manual on rulership that was written at some point during the 1200s. Now, this is well after conversion, and one could argue this doesn't make it a great source for talking about the spirituality, but it is a very useful source for talking about navigational practices, because the Konungsskuggsja goes into considerable detail about what is necessary to have skills in wayfinding. Now, to some extent, the rulers of that time may or may not have had this direct knowledge themselves, but it certainly would have been at least necessary for an aspiring ruler within post-conversion or pre-conversion Scandinavia to at least to be able to determine if a prospective sailor or navigator was really worth their salt, or if they were trying to sell you a bill of goods regarding their skills on the high seas. Njord, as a god of sailing, thus becomes much more than just navigation and knowing how to handle oars and sails. He becomes this kind of liminal figure whose role and significance depends very much on having intimate knowledge of the world around him, granting that knowledge to those who seek his guidance, and being able to apply it in a way that leads to your ship coming in safely. This also makes Njord something of a god of wealth, since travel by sea was the most efficient way to move goods in bulk in this world, especially if you're talking places like Norway, which was an extremely mountainous part of the world, still is, and traveling by ship was much easier in these times than trying to go overland. This brings us to the question of magic and the Vanir, particularly Seidr, a Nordic form of mysticism which I got into a bit in the previous explainer on magic and mysticism. Seidr, as I covered there, is an art that very much hinges on working between worlds and with different powers, as opposed to necessarily imposing one's will on the world around you. This fits well with the Vanir's place as being gods of the liminal, as being deities of these in-between places and in-between arts. Freya, in particular, is especially known for being a powerful sorceress whose skill in Seidr is so great that Odin seeks her out to learn the arts of Seidr from Freya. This magical skill is also what allows the Vanir to fight the Aesir to a draw in the first war after the creation of Midgard. The beginning of this war is described in a few different places as starting when Gullveig came into the presence of the Aesir. And the Aesir, for various reasons that aren't really fully described in surviving source materials, become overcome with lust for Gullveig that is so great that they end up killing her and throwing her upon a fire. At which point she brings herself back to life, which leads to the Aesir trying again, and she brings herself back again, and so why not take a third crack at it, which leads to pretty much the same outcome as the previous two attempts. This act of violence leads to extended conflict between these two groups, and it is specifically mentioned in source materials that while the Aesir were mightier in their warcraft and greater in their skill of violence in all its forms, the Vanir had superior mastery of the mystical arts. And this allowed them to effectively fight the Aesir to a standstill, ultimately forcing the conflict to be resolved not through mutual destruction or one side imposing their will on the other, but a mutually agreed upon peace, which included an exchange of hostages, with Freyr, Freya, and Njord going to the Aesir as hostages on behalf of the Vanir, and Honir and Mimir being sent by the Aesir as hostages to the Vanir. These hostages were meant as guarantees of good behavior on both sides, and there does seem to have been a return to at least somewhat amicable relations between these different groups of deities after this peace was achieved. This conflict is sometimes pointed to scholars as evidence of this earlier migration theory of the Aesir coming with pastoral nomads, or possibly coming with agriculturalists, or even possibly the reverse of the Vanir coming with either pastoral nomads or agriculturalists. Again, direct evidence is a little sparse here. But it's interesting that the way this gets resolved is not through ultimate violence and destruction, but by reaching a mutually acceptable accord between the two groups. This, I think, reinforces the argument that I've made, that I know Rune Rasmussen makes, and many others are beginning to increasingly make within the heathen movement, that Ragnarok is less some kind of Revelations-esque inevitable battle that must be fought, and more a consequence of a breakdown of relations between the different groups of gods within Nordic myth and their ability to reach equitable and peaceful resolutions to these conflicts. Returning back to the Vanir, even though there are Aesir, like Odin and Frigg, who are said to have great skill in the mystical arts, there is no question at any point that the Vanir are always superior to the Aesir in this regard. This is also something that I think is further reinforced by the Vanir's close relationships with the Alfar. The Alfar are animistic beings who I've mentioned before that are somewhat similar in very broad strokes to the Fae or the hidden folk that you see in other similar bodies of folklore that exist within Europe. The Vanir are a bit different from other animistic powers within Nordic myth in that they are more associated with magic, illusion, and to an extent deception and trickery. They are both said to dwell within their own particular places and hollow hills, as well as having their own realm known as Alfheim. And Freyr specifically is named as being king of Alfheim and the Alfar, something which really cements the close relationship between the Vanir and the Alfar. And also, I think, further reinforces this sort of liminal, mystical nature of the Vanir. Through their ties to the Alfar, the Vanir are further shown to be beings that are suffused with this in-betweenness, with this movement between worlds, that they're gods not just of human activities that move between humanity and the natural world around us, they are also gods who are closely connected with a whole group of beings whose very nature is liminal. And so, to wrap things up, and to sort of stop repeating myself on these particular points, the Vanir are, on the surface, gods of the natural world, but are more accurately understood as deities that are associated with liminalness, in-betweenness, and moving between the worlds. Deities who move as much through mysticism as through specific human activities that cross boundaries, that invite us to focus on relationship with what is around us, rather than necessarily conflict and opposition. This also is further reinforced by how their relationship with the Aesir is one which began somewhat in a place of conflict, but came to a more equitable resolution despite that conflict through peacemaking. Nothing further hammers home this central theme of in-between relationship-based deity than their close connections with Seidr and the mystical arts of Nordic practice, as Seidr in particular is a form of mysticism that is very much about crossing boundaries and moving through as well as manipulating the relationships between different beings and entities that exist within the cosmos. That, in a nutshell, is the Vanir. Thank you for tuning in to this explainer. This is Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.